My name is David, and this is the story of how my father shattered our lives, stealing our innocence, and forcing us into a nightmare of his own making, a nightmare I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. It all began when I was 10. My sister, Emily, was just 8. Back then, we were like any other family living in a peaceful suburb in Ohio. My mom worked tirelessly as a nurse at the local hospital, while Dad had a well-paying job as an engineer for a defense contractor. Little did I know, his work wasn't just a job, it was the spark that set his mind on fire with delusions and paranoia. The day my mom died was the day our lives took a grim turn. It was a freak accident, a collision on the way home from her late-night shift. We were shattered. Emily and I mourned openly, but Dad? He buried himself in the basement. He stopped being the father we knew, consumed instead by endless muttering and frantic scribbling in a notebook he guarded like a sacred text. About a month after the funeral, he summoned Emily and me for a family meeting. His eyes were wild, glittering with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Kids," he began, his voice trembling with suppressed excitement, "I've discovered something. Something incredible. Something that will keep us safe." Emily glanced at me, her face mirroring my confusion. "Safe from what?" Dad launched into a fevered monologue about the world's dangers. He spoke of impending nuclear war, of radioactive fallout, and the collapse of civilization as we knew it. His words spilled out faster and faster, his voice rising in pitch until he seemed on the verge of hysteria. "But you don't need to be afraid," he said, suddenly breaking into a manic grin that sent a chill down my spine. "Because I've built something. Something that will save us when the world ends." He took us to the basement to show us his masterpiece. Where there had once been dusty shelves and forgotten boxes, there was now a stark, imposing bunker. Thick concrete walls loomed around us, and a steel vault door guarded the entrance. Inside, there were rows of canned food, massive barrels of water, first aid kits, gas masks, and weapons. Dad's pride was palpable as he pointed out every detail. The air filtration system. The hidden escape hatch. The emergency generator. "We're ready," he said, his eyes shining with something that felt disturbingly close to glee. For weeks, life pretended to go back to normal. Emily and I still went to school, and Dad still left for work. But every evening, we were dragged into that bunker for grueling drills. We practiced sealing the door, putting on masks, and rationing food as if our lives depended on it. He'd pace back and forth, drilling us on survival procedures, his voice a constant drumbeat of fear and urgency. Then came the night that obliterated whatever was left of our normalcy. I was yanked from sleep by the shrieking wail of air raid sirens. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to make sense of the chaos. Before I could even move, Dad burst into my room, his face a mask of determination, and something darker. "It's happening!" Dad yelled, his voice slicing through the shrill wail of the sirens. "We need to get to the shelter now." Before I could fully register his words, he grabbed me by the arm and hauled me out of bed, his grip painfully tight. Down the dim hallway, I saw my sister Emily, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her cheeks streaked with tears. Dad corralled us both with a frantic urgency, steering us down the stairs toward the basement. The shelter door loomed ahead, bathed in an unsettling crimson light from the emergency bulbs Dad had installed. "Inside!" he barked, shoving us forward. "Hurry! There's no time!" The heavy steel door clanged shut behind us with an ominous finality. The sound of the locks engaging was like the knell of a bell marking the end of the life we'd known. The sirens became muffled whispers behind the thick concrete walls, and we were plunged into an eerie, humming silence. Dad dropped to his knees and gathered us into a tight, suffocating hug. "We're safe now," he said, his voice trembling with something I couldn't quite place: relief, madness, or maybe both. "Everything's going to be all right." But it wasn't all right. Nothing about what followed was all right. We huddled together in one of the cramped bunk beds as the hours stretched into eternity. Dad kept glancing at his watch and a Geiger counter mounted on the wall, muttering cryptic calculations about fallout and radiation levels. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional hiss of the air filtration system and the faint, persistent hum of our confinement. When the sirens finally stopped, I thought we'd be allowed to leave. But Dad insisted we couldn't, claiming the radiation outside would kill us instantly. Days turned into weeks, and his resolve only hardened. Emily and I pleaded with him. We wanted to see the sun, our friends, and the world we had left behind. But he shut us down with chilling certainty. "There's nothing left out there," he said one day, his voice heavy with finality. His eyes burned with conviction as he leaned in close. "They're all gone. Everyone. We survived because I knew what was coming. Do you understand how lucky we are?" At first, we believed him. He was our father. Why would he lie? Weeks bled into months, and the bunker became a twisted parody of home. The TV and radio were useless, emitting nothing but static, something Dad attributed to an electromagnetic pulse from the nuclear blasts. Yet, sometimes, I'd catch him late at night, fiddling with the dials, his face clouded with frustration. We fell into a grim routine. Dad homeschooled, us using old, dog-eared textbooks. He insisted on daily exercise to keep us strong. We rationed our food meticulously, though the portions were always meager. Every day felt like a lifetime, each moment dragging into the next with unbearable monotony. The air was stale, thick with the smell of canned food and desperation. Emily, my bright, lively sister, faded before my eyes. She stopped laughing. She stopped playing. Most days, she sat in the corner of the shelter, staring at the concrete walls like they held the answers to an unspoken question. I tried to keep her spirits up. I told her stories, played silly games, and did everything I could to make her smile. But it wasn't enough. We were prisoners of our father's madness, and it was breaking us. The longer we stayed, the more unhinged Dad became. His paranoia grew insurmountable, his mutterings about conspiracies turning darker and more nonsensical. He became obsessed with rationing, cutting our already meager portions in half, claiming we had to prepare for the long haul. He prowled the shelter at night, sometimes pausing to stand over us while we slept. I'd wake to find him watching us with an expression I couldn't decipher, something between love and a terrible, haunting sadness. That was when I started to notice inconsistencies. Cans of food with suspiciously new labels. A faint, fleeting sound of distant traffic when Dad thought we couldn't hear. And then came the night I followed him. I woke to the sound of the shelter door creaking open. My heart raced as I slipped from my bunk, careful not to wake Emily. Peering around the corner, I saw Dad stepping through the doorway, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. My pulse thundered in my ears as I crept closer, just in time to wedge my foot in the door before it could seal shut. I watched through the narrow gap as he ascended the basement stairs. I hesitated, fear and curiosity warring within me. Then, summoning every ounce of courage, I pushed the door open and followed him. The basement was cold and quiet, lit by the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the windows. I crept up the stairs, careful to avoid the creaky spots. At the top, I peeked out and saw Dad slipping out the back door. For a moment, I thought of retreating, of going back to Emily and pretending I hadn't seen anything. But the questions burning in my mind wouldn't let me. I stepped outside and followed him into the night. The basement was a maze of shadows, thick with dust and the smell of mildew. Every step I took on the creaky stairs felt like an invitation for them to betray me, to alert Dad to my escape. My heart pounded so loudly that it seemed to echo off the concrete walls. At the top of the stairs, I paused, my breath shallow and uneven. The door to the main house was slightly ajar. Through the crack, I heard sounds that made me freeze, a low hum, rhythmic and steady. It took me a moment to realize what it was, the refrigerator. I hadn't heard that sound in years. Steeling myself, I pushed the door open just enough to step through. Moonlight poured through the kitchen windows, bathing the room in a silvery glow. The scene before me was surreal, a snapshot from a life I thought was gone forever. The calendar on the wall marked the current year, a cruel reminder of how long we'd been underground. Fresh fruit sat in a bowl on the counter, its vibrant colors mocking the bland rations we lived on. It was a gut punch of reality. The world hadn't ended. Life above ground was not only intact, it was thriving. Then I heard it, the faint creak of the front door opening. My heart jumped into my throat. Dad was back. Panic gripped me as I slipped back down the stairs, my movements as silent as I could manage. I barely made it to my bunk before the shelter door hissed open. I pulled the blanket over me, trembling as I heard Dad's heavy footsteps re-enter the room. The next morning felt suffocating. As Dad prepared our rationed breakfast, the lie he lived seemed more grotesque than ever. He was cheerful, even humming softly as he set the plates down, each containing the same bland, powdered eggs we had eaten for years. "Eat up," he said, his tone infuriatingly paternal. "We've got a big day ahead." I forced myself to eat, each bite tasting like ash. Sarah sat across from me, picking at her plate. Her small face was pinched with weariness, her eyes dull with resignation. Seeing her like that lit a fire in me. I had to get us out. That night, when the shelter was quiet and Dad's soft snoring filled the air, I shook Sarah awake. Her eyes fluttered open, confused and wary, but she didn't protest as I led her to the far corner of the shelter. "Sarah, listen to me," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the air filtration system. "I found something. Last night, I went upstairs. The world isn't destroyed. Everything Dad told us, it's a lie." Her eyes widened, tears welling as the weight of my words hit her. But why would he do that?" I hesitated, my throat tightening. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we have to leave, Sarah. We can't stay here anymore." She buried her face in her hands, shaking her head. "How? He has the key. He'll never let us go. I'll figure something out," I promised, gripping her shoulders. "We just have to stay calm and wait for the right moment." The following weeks stretched into an eternity. Sarah and I tried to act normal, but every interaction with Dad felt like a performance. Every smile, every response, was carefully calculated to avoid his suspicion. Meanwhile, I continued to study the shelter, searching for a weakness. When Dad tasked me with maintenance work, I seized the opportunity to memorize every inch of the space. The more I learned, the more determined I became. Then, one day, I found the panel. It was hidden in the wall near the air filtration system, cleverly disguised as part of the concrete. My fingers trembled as I pried it open, revealing a secret compartment stuffed with documents. Newspapers, emails, and handwritten notes spilled out, each more damning than the last. The newspapers showed headlines I never expected to see: economic downturns, natural disasters, and celebrity scandals. Life had gone on above ground while we were buried alive. The emails were worse. They detailed Dad's extended leave of absence from work, citing a family emergency that was apparently ongoing. But the journal, that was the real revelation. In its pages, Dad had poured out his thoughts, paranoia, guilt, and a twisted sense of righteousness. He believed the world was a cesspool of corruption, a place unfit for his children. In his mind, the shelter wasn't a prison but a sanctuary. As I read, anger surged through me. He hadn't saved us. He'd stolen us. That night, I replaced the panel, my hands steady despite the storm inside me. I knew now what I was dealing with. Dad wasn't just a liar, he was a fanatic, consumed by his delusions. As I lay awake, staring at the dim ceiling, I realized the enormity of what lay ahead. Escaping wouldn't be easy. Dad had absolute control over the shelter and our resources. But he wasn't infallible. He was human, and humans make mistakes. It was a matter of waiting, watching, and striking at the right time. But time was running out. Sarah was wilting under the strain, her hope fading with each passing day. And I could see the cracks forming in Dad's carefully constructed facade. He was growing more erratic, his paranoia deepening. We were living on a knife's edge, and it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. The air in the room seemed to freeze, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Mrs. Callahan's hand wavered on the phone, her face pale and stricken with fear. "Dad," I said, forcing steel into my voice despite the terror clawing at me. "It's over. We're not going back with you." He tilted his head slightly, his expression one of cold, clinical detachment. "Oh, Michael! You've always been so headstrong. So naive. You don't understand the world like I do. Everything I've done was to keep you safe, to protect you and Sarah." "Protect us?" I shot back, my voice rising. "You stole our lives, Dad. You kept us locked away in that hole while the world moved on without us." His knuckles whitened as he gripped the pipe tighter, but his voice remained calm, almost gentle. "And look at what the world has become," he said, gesturing vaguely to the house around us. "A world of corruption, violence, decay. You can't see it yet, but out there, it'll destroy you. I'm the only one who can keep you safe." Behind him, Mrs. Callahan shifted, her trembling fingers still clutching the phone. "I am calling the police," she stammered. Dad's head snapped toward her, his expression darkening. "Put that down," he ordered, his voice low and menacing. She hesitated, fear flickering across her face. I couldn't let him intimidate her. I couldn't let him take control again. "Run, Mrs. Callahan!" I shouted. "Get out of here!" The distraction worked. She bolted toward the kitchen, the phone clutched to her chest. Dad turned to pursue her, but I acted on instinct, throwing myself forward and tackling him. The pipe clattered to the floor as we went down in a tangle of limbs. "Sarah, run!" I yelled as I grappled with him, my muscles straining against his larger frame. But Sarah didn't run. Instead, I saw her out of the corner of my eye clutching the pipe. Her small hands trembled, her face a mask of fear and determination. "Stay back!" she screamed, holding the pipe like a weapon. Dad froze, his eyes flicking toward her. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in his expression. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice thick with feigned sorrow. "Honey, put that down. You don't want to hurt me. I'm your father." She hesitated, the pipe wavering. "Don't listen to him," I shouted, struggling to keep him pinned. "He's lying, Sarah! He'll never let us go." Her grip tightened, her knuckles turning white. "You don't get to hurt us anymore," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. With a sudden burst of strength, Dad shoved me off and lunged for her. She swung the pipe with all her might, the dull clang of metal meeting flesh reverberating through the room. Dad staggered, clutching his shoulder, his face contorted in pain. "You," he began, but his words were cut off by the distant wail of sirens. Mrs. Callahan had done it. Dad's eyes darted toward the door, then back to us. For a moment I saw the man I once called my father, the man who used to tuck us in at night and read us stories. But that man was long gone, replaced by the shadow before us. "You think they'll protect you?" he spat, his voice venomous. "You'll see. The world will chew you up and spit you out. And when it does, you'll come crawling back to me." The sirens grew louder, flashing red and blue lights spilling through the windows. Dad's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw defeat in his eyes. He didn't fight as I stepped between him and Sarah, the pipe still clutched in her trembling hands. The police arrived moments later, flooding the house with their commanding presence. Dad was taken away in handcuffs, his protests drowned out by the officer's stern commands. As they led him out, he turned to look at us one last time, his face twisted in a mix of rage and sorrow. "You'll regret this," he said. But as the door closed behind him, a weight lifted from my chest. In the days that followed, Sarah and I began the slow process of adjusting to life in the real world. It wasn't easy. The sunlight felt too bright, the noises too loud, the people too overwhelming. We had missed so much, and the gap between us and everyone else seemed insurmountable. But we had each other. And with Mrs. Callahan's help, we started to piece our lives back together. Dad's trial loomed on the horizon, a daunting shadow over our newfound freedom. But for the first time in years, we had hope. We were free. And no matter how difficult the road ahead, we knew we would face it together. Mrs. Jackson moved to stand in front of us, her phone clutched in her hand. "Mark, what have you done? These kids. They are my kids," Dad snarled, his calm veneer crumbling into an animalistic rage. "And I will do whatever it takes to protect them. Even from fools like you." He stepped into the room, the pipe glinting in his hands, raised as though daring anyone to challenge him. Mrs. Jackson didn't move, but her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her phone tighter. "Run," she whispered sharply to us, her eyes meeting mine with a plea. "I'll hold him off. Just go." It all happened so fast. One moment, Dad was staring her down with cold determination, and the next, he lunged at her like a predator. I heard the sickening thud of metal on flesh as Mrs. Jackson crumpled to the floor. Cassie let out a blood-curdling scream, and adrenaline surged through me like fire. "Move!" I yelled, grabbing Cassie's hand and bolting for the back door. Behind us, his footsteps thundered, heavy and relentless, paired with the chilling echo of his voice. "Ryan! Cassie! You can't survive out there! Come back, now!" But we knew better. The only thing we needed to escape was the maniac chasing us, the man who had once been our father. The night seemed endless. We darted through alleyways, cutting across unfamiliar backyards and scrambling over fences. My lungs burned, my muscles screamed, and every sound, every creak, rustle, or bark, felt like it heralded Dad's arrival. But no matter how close he seemed, we didn't stop. When dawn finally broke, we collapsed onto a park bench on the outskirts of town. I held Cassie close as she sobbed quietly, her face buried in my shoulder. Around us, the world felt indifferent to our nightmare. Joggers ambled by with headphones in, a woman walked her dog, and the smell of coffee from a nearby cafe wafted through the cool morning air. It was jarring how normal everything looked. "What now?" Cassie whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, a police car pulled into the lot nearby. 2 officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the area before locking onto us. My heart raced. For a split second, I debated running again, but deep down, I knew this was what we needed. This was the end of the chase. The officers approached cautiously, their expressions softening as they seemed to recognize us. "Ryan and Cassie?" one of them asked gently. We nodded. What followed was a whirlwind. We were taken to the police station, wrapped in blankets, and given food. They asked us about the shelter, about Dad, about everything. At first, I was reluctant to say much. Part of me still feared what Dad would do if he somehow got to us again. But Cassie's wide, fearful eyes gave me courage. I spoke for her, and for me. The authorities launched a manhunt for Dad that day. It didn't take them long to find him. 3 days later, they cornered him in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. He barricaded himself inside, ranting about conspiracies and how the world was a cesspool of lies. Negotiators tried to reason with him, but it was no use. When they finally breached the building, he fought like a cornered animal. The man who once cradled me in his arms after nightmares now seemed incapable of recognizing humanity, even in himself. The trial became a nationwide spectacle. News channels dissected every piece of our story, turning our lives into fodder for debates on mental illness, survivalist paranoia, and child abuse. Experts were called in to analyze Dad's descent into madness. Some pitied him, painting him as a tragic figure consumed by delusion. Others weren't so kind, labeling him as a sadistic manipulator. Sitting in that courtroom, I saw Dad for what he truly was, a man who had traded his soul for control. He looked at us once as they read his life sentence, his face a twisted mask of betrayal and anguish. "I did it to protect you," he said, his voice hollow. "You'll see. One day you'll see." That was the last time I ever looked into his eyes. The years after were a haze of therapy, education, and relearning how to live. For Cassie, it was like waking up in a world that had moved on without her. She buried herself in school, determined to make something of herself. She thrived academically, her hunger for knowledge insatiable. For me, it wasn't so simple. My thoughts often strayed back to Dad's words, his actions. Could I ever truly escape his influence, his twisted worldview? Even now, in the quiet moments, his voice echoes in my mind, taunting me with doubts. Cassie went on to study psychology, hoping to help others who'd endured unimaginable trauma. I turned to writing, pouring my fears, anger, and guilt onto the page. Each word felt like a small rebellion against the shadow Dad had cast over my life. But even with time and distance, the scars remain. Sometimes, I wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the phantom hum of the shelter's ventilation system filling my ears. The air feels too thin, the walls too close. And in those moments, I have to remind myself, I'm free. I'm not underground anymore. The true fallout of Dad's actions isn't something tangible like radiation or ruins. It's in the lingering fear, the constant vigilance, the walls we build around ourselves long after the threat is gone. And that, I've realized, is a prison all its own. If you've read this far, take my advice. Treasure your freedom, question the stories you're told, and never underestimate the power of lies, especially the ones we tell ourselves. Because sometimes, the biggest danger isn't out there. It's in here.